Welcome to Creative Mornings. How are you all feeling? Awesome. The theme of honesty requires us to look at ourselves past those stylized Instagram stories and really face who we are. Truth and authenticity require vulnerability, and that can't happen without honesty. We're super excited to invite Ivar Selvaag to speak about how he's faced honesty in his career. So please help me give a warm welcome to Per.
Blessed with a voice like this, you can imagine what a powerhouse speaker I am born as. This is not the sort of subject that I feel I have the moral authority to speak about necessarily. I feel that it's a very humbling and momentous kind of subject. And this is a Creative Mornings forum by title and also by audience, I suspect. So I asked myself, how can I be of use to a creative audience in Oakland, California, as just little me? And I thought, this is how we all started out once upon a time, little and cute. Even Supreme Court justices started out like this. And as we grow, we actually become more and more complicated. We become so complicated, in fact, that we make a business out of becoming opaque and mysterious. And we end up actually in a position where sometimes we suspend honesty, or our ability to be honesty, between truth and lies, motivated primarily by our own personal gain. So I'm not going to talk about this at length, but I'm not better than these guys. I am just a human being, as are you. And I think the interesting thing is that as creatives, we use this word a lot. What does it mean? It's certainly a tired trope when creatives talk about authenticity or honesty in their work. But I think we all mean it. We don't say it just because. We actually have good intentions, and we're, I think, most of the time, pretty earnest in our attempt to create honest and authentic experiences. I just want to come at this subject a little sideways, and hopefully by the time I'm done, you've put one and one together in a fashion that turns out to become two. I want to talk a little bit about my own origin. It's not super interesting, apart from to me. I grew up in a country where people, those are not my legs, by the way, where people say hello by just facing each other, essentially saying nothing. That's acknowledgement right there. So you can imagine a country like that in comparison with a nation like yours, where you give hugs for everything and high fives, and you know, it's pretty strong contrast culturally and sociologically. I'm obviously not born in Norway, in case you couldn't tell. I'm born in Asia. But as a little boy, I was adopted. I say that quite openly. I don't think it's particularly, it's not a sensitive issue, and I'm very grateful for that. I grew up on this little island with a red dot on it. It's a little island of 300 people. Everybody's married to their cousin. My family's been on our family farm literally for 400 years, and I went to school here. I went to school there for 7 years. I moved there with one of my first jobs. I lived there for 3 years and before I moved to Detroit. Then I moved to Munich in Germany and lived there for 5 years. And I lived here for a couple of years before I landed here in the Bay Area. About 6 years ago, I started a firm. It wasn't a very glamorous or romantic tale of how someone pursued their dreams and they rode off into the sunset and lived happily ever after. But I did, in any case. And the question is, what do you do as a creative in the East Bay? If you're going to try and build a brand for yourself, how, in fact, do you do that in a way that is in any way significant? This has got to be the most saturated design market in the world. There's tons of firms. So what have you got to bring? Who are you? I'm just a foreign Johnny. What do I have to bring? What could I possibly have to bring? I've always been super fascinated by the reason I want to do something, the reason why other people want to compel me to do something, or why they want to do something. And I think you can only speak with any authority about your own experiences, I think. This is actually my mother. I bet you right now she's sitting doing this very thing. She's knitting. Ever since I was a little boy, I remember this. She knitted all the time, and she loves knitting, and she's really, really good at it. This is her in her 20s, early 20s, as an alpine competitive skier. She's dressed in wool, of course. This is me, my sister, and my father, all dressed in my mother's knits. Here I am walking my dog. That's actually what she was knitting in that little reel. I fell ill a couple of years ago and I ended in a hospital. I woke up one day and I had that thing next to me in that jacket that was knitted by my grandmother, my mother's mother. These are my children now. They're all dressed in, you guessed it. And this is the chair in my office. It's got a sheep. I'm sorry, it had to die in order to land on my Californian chair. But it's a sheep from one of the islands close to my island where I'm from. So you see, you're getting the picture. Wool is kind of everywhere in my life. And I have never thought about it until, well, quite recently. This is actually where I'm from. This is Selvaag, the farm of my family. Those are some of my girlfriends right there. Some more of them right here. And that's me. I remember being little and watching my dad literally pull some lambs out of a sheep because some sheep aren't able to naturally give birth. I can actually do that in a pinch. So if you ask me about wool, I feel much more comfortable answering you about wool than I do about honesty. Now, Norway, the island, this is images that I took from the island where I'm from. It's sort of, I know the smell of any weather. 300 people leaves you a lot of space, personal space. And weather is something beyond what's on your screen. It's something you're out in, whether you like it or not, in order to get to school or to see other people. This landscape is, you take it for granted when you grow up. Now living here, I look at these pictures and I think, that's home. I know the temperature there, I can tell by the light, and obviously by the missing leaves as well. But in any case, you get a sort of relationship to nature and materials that are different to if you grew up in a city, say. I'm not going to say if it's better or worse, but it is what it is. And these images are important because they say something about how I weight visual stuff. They say something about what becomes your instinctive preference for just about anything in your creative work. And these are just images. This is something my grandfather painted. He was a rose painter. Images from the island. But how does all of this stuff translate into a career? With hindsight, I wasn't conscious of this until, like I said, recently. And since we're here, you have to be conscious of what you do and why you do it. You know, the Bay Area is full, if nothing else, of very discerning, smart, educated people who have plenty of choice regardless of what they want. So being aware as a creative of who you are, why you do something, and why people should come work with you becomes like existentially important. So I want to rewind a few years. I used to run my own department for a French car brand called Peugeot. Any of you know that brand? Probably a lot of you sat in the back seat of one of these things conked out on the side of a highway in America back in the 80s and 90s. This is a brand which is associated primarily with sort of econo cars. Great brand, and I loved working there. But my boss came in one day and he said, any French people in here, by the way? Okay, I can put on a French accent. He goes, Père, it would be cool to do a supercar, no? And, you know, You don't tell a Frenchman no. You just don't. So I said, Jean-Pierre, brilliant idea, brilliant. Let's do a supercar. And then the job is, how do you make relevance between a supercar project and the actual core brand values, which is accessibility, economy, reliability? So, faced with a task like that, you have to think, what is this brand? What is its cultural identity? And what's its relevance to the rest of the world? Supercars, those are things that Germans and you Americans and the Italians make. French, they make other stuff. But what we ended up with was this thing, which, yes, it's low, it's wide, it goes quickly, all that stuff. But honestly, that is not A, relevant, B, important. But in talking with our design team, we discussed the potential of doing something totally different using this more or less as a canvas. And what we ended up with was a tale of materials instead. What are the French good at? What are the French famous for? They're famous for their fashion, and their visual expression is kind of distinct and brave and known all over the world. So how can we associate that with a car brand? We actually discovered a material made by some Dutch artists. It's actually a newspaper called newspaper wood. It's newspaper rolled into logs and glued in between each layer and then sawed and dried. And it turns out to be a really cool, environmentally friendly, super light material that, if treated right, is eminently qualifiable for a supercar, especially one from France. So the dashboard of this thing is actually made from newspaper wood. You can read the year rings in this newspaper wood just like you could in any wood, which is sort of hilarious. And it's ironic. It's also not something you'd find in a German product. So maybe you remember that wool. Wool is actually brilliant. It's a brilliant material. A, it's beautiful. B, it's natural. C, it's light. D, it's flame retardant. And E, it is brilliant inside of a vehicle. You can't imagine this vehicle again in an Audi, but in a French vehicle, as a piece of French expression, it's natural. Now you understand the origin of this material for this vehicle. But it's French. And if people think, is that French or is it Norwegian, they'll probably say that's French. But I had a say in this vehicle because this was my project and we spent a lot of money building it. This is me looking really cool, right? And one more example, I mean, that alone as a case doesn't prove much necessarily. But then let's look at another project. The Vikings are famous all over the world for their crazy ways. But one thing they were really good at was to build stuff out of wood. And actually, their sails were made out of wool. So wood and craftsmanship in Norway is something that goes back quite a long ways. When I was about 13, 14, I started playing the organ in 3 different Norwegian churches, and this was one of them. This was the view from the pew where I sat and played the organ every Sunday. Quite a lot of wood, as you can see. And Norwegians love wood. We have a different relationship with wood to most other people. Norwegians are not terribly sophisticated, but we're extremely good with utility. When we use something, it's because we need it. Wood isn't necessarily something that you polish up and hang on the wall and sort of put a thick layer of glaze on top of. It's actually material that we like to scrape up and shave down and maintain over time. This vehicle, it's called the Peugeot HX1, has wood from door to door because we treated it instead of a priced natural material. We decided to use its utility. So this is super thin, it's milled on both sides, and it's treated sort of like a Viking ship, side to side. And you remember those light, the light images from the island? Light is sort of, I decide where to sit in a restaurant based on the way the light falls. Maybe you do too. Light is super important. It's as real as a physical thing. A couple of the other projects that I've done, I did this restoration of this car. It's an ongoing project, don't ask me about it. But the interior is dressed up in Norwegian wool. And we did a coffee machine a couple of years in my firm, just for fun, just for the hell of it. And everything's made of steel in this business, so we decided to make one out of an honest material, concrete. So you see, this thing, honesty in material, is one thing. On the one hand, it's super artistic and somewhat abstract as the way I carefully explain it. But it has real-world applications. This is an English car brand, and sure enough, the interior actually is made of wool. This is the way, in my view, it relates to the Norwegian identity, wool. It represents proud tradition. It's an ingrained part of our history in Norway. It's firmly rooted in our countryside. Up until 1930, there was only 1 million people. The whole place was just one large countryside. So how do you guys view Norway? I'd like to ask you. You can answer me afterwards. But I think, I've lived abroad for quite a few years, the way Norway is viewed by foreigners, or by people not from Norway, rather, it's a country where the Nobel Peace Prize is handed out every year, fittingly, because it's so trustworthy, right? Authenticity is something you associate with a cold, sparse north, and honest. Of course it's clean, pristine, Norwegian water. You guys pay $7 a bottle for it in the shape of Voss. Everything comes back to identity. Who are we? We can't help that. My identity springs out of this. My mother's history and her growing up as her son is what gave me my identity, despite how I look. And this all comes back to quiet mornings and evenings and my mother knitting. And when I look back on it now, I can tell you and you can tell me and nod, hopefully, this has really shaped my sort of expression and life's work so far. So identity, inheritance, those things are important things. It's nothing to do with money, but everything to do with culture and identity. This is what makes me different, not necessarily better than anybody else in the room. The particulars of the island, my mother, the stuff that had an influence on how I viewed design projects. And I dare say it's also what gives you your particular personal edge and what makes you special as a creative. Thank you very much.